Today, Dr. Kumfer will share more with us from John Paul II, Carol Watiwa, as well as some others on their understanding of the human person. First, a little background about our speaker. Dr. Kumfer holds degrees in philosophy from Catholic University of America, where he has also completed graduate work in the areas of theology and religious education. He earned a doctorate in philosophy in 1982 from Southern Illinois University at Carbondale. This past Friday evening at our employee recognition banquet, Dr. Kumfer was honored for his 45 years here at the University of St. Francis in our Department of Philosophy Theology. For about 35 years, he has served as our department chair. As you can imagine, Dr. Kumfer has taught many different courses, served on a variety of committees, and has a whole repertoire of interests, just a few of which I will mention. For the last 15 years, he has served in various capacities within the Boy Scouts of America. Related to his interest in bioethics issues, Dr. Kumfer serves on the Ethics Committee of DuPont Hospital, Visiting Nurse Service, and Hospice Home. He is also an ethics consultant to the Allen County Fort Wayne Health Commissioner. Along with his ongoing study of the interconnection of religion and science, Dr. Kumfer is a member of the Midwest Religion and Science Society. And even more specifically related to today's lecture, in recent years, he has been appointed a fellow of the Midwest Center for Religion and Consciousness. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Earl Kumfer.
Thank you. Thank you, sister. I hope to talk for about an hour or less, and then I'd rather have a good deal of discussion. But if there should be a burning question any place along the way, don't be afraid to stop me, because that question might get lost if you have to wait another 15 or 20 minutes even. You should have 3 sets of handouts. We were trying to circulate. I hope you got all 3 pieces as you came in, and I'll be warning you when to look at those. Instead of putting things in PowerPoint, and as you can see, there is way too much to put in PowerPoint, and just in terms of words, but also to give you something that you could write on. I tried to jimmy the right margin a bit so you got some extra space and space on the backs. Knowing the compulsion of students to take notes, I thought I would fill in some of those things. So some of what you are hearing you might also be seeing at the same time. The emphasis there is then you've got it twice in sensory processes, and perhaps the inflections in my voice might harden some of that a bit more. There may not be universal and detailed agreement as to what consciousness is. In fact, there's a great argument going on right now about that. But that consciousness is certain. There is no doubt in any of our minds that there is such a thing as consciousness. Ordinary first-person experiences establish beyond any argument that consciousness does exist. At this very moment, you are aware that you heard the word consciousness. You are also aware of some notion or understanding of what that word means. So we already know at least 2 parts of consciousness that are operating. You've already caught yourself in the act of being conscious. In fact, it is so ordinary an experience that you probably pay little attention to it. If in response to my making this last comment, you reflect that your awareness is uniquely yours and that you do not experience my consciousness or that of anyone else in this room, you're also conscious perhaps of agreeing or disagreeing with what I just claimed this second time. All of that is conscious behavior of a great deal of variety of things. You know it exists, at least in you. You may wonder if it exists in any of the rest of us. You may wonder if it exists even in your pets. Experiences of consciousness from a first-person perspective, which is what you're experienced, are called qualia. You should have something like this in your notes, but what I wanted to display and talk about for just a moment are these qualia. They are intrinsic, they are consciously accessible, they are non-representational, they are features of phenomenal objects that we have somewhere in what we call our consciousness. Sometimes these are sense data, and sometimes they are other mental things. At this point, I'm not going to argue about what kinds of things they might be. They come in a great variety of forms: perceptual experiences, seeing red rather than seeing green. Unless you're a red-green colorblind, then you might not have had two different experiences at all. Smelling skunk, feeling the roughness of sandpaper, those are all perceptual. There are also body or whole body experiences like feeling pain, having an itch, being hungry, feeling dizzy, feeling sick. Or emotion really are consciousness behaviors: delight, fear, regret, grief. Moods like depression, calm, being bored. I hope not yet. Other experiences like understanding a sentence, noticing something is missing from a list, suddenly remembering something. All of those are conscious behaviors, they're conscious activities. For a number of years now, the hard problem in psychology and philosophy has been expressible in a couple of different ways. One of those is, how do subjective experiences arise in objective brains? Let me add the third person dimension here. We have folks who are in the business of experimenting in our brains, figuring out from the outside, if you will, what's going on there. Some of them claim that certain kinds of behaviors, certain kinds of mental acts occur in certain locations, or they're describing certain mechanisms of those flowing and so on. But how do those first person and third person kinds of behaviors connect, or do they? Some would argue they don't. Also, how would you explain them? How can an external event give rise to an internal experience? That's the hard problem, and it's the hard problem that many folks have been working on, and I think I'm getting closer to a solution. It may take me another light year or two to get there, but still working on it. 11 months ago, in a different lecture hall on this campus, many of us explored this issue from the perspective of first-person singular experience. If you'd like to go look at that, it's on our website in the iTunes College under Philosophy Theology lecture series. This afternoon, we can move on to probe some failed accounts of the hard problem of consciousness, and then start sorting out some promising pieces, perhaps innovative functions, of a realistic, effective solution to the mystery of consciousness. A third point: brick walls or impasses between science and religion, between traditionalist, modernist, and postmodernist, are often not over who has the truth, although that's where sometimes we want to make the argument lie, or who has the truth more completely if you're being nice in the argument. Often unproductive arguments or confrontations are such not because of bad thinking, or even because someone has bad evidence. Often it may not even be over who has reasonable or logical conclusions. As in this case, I believe, the gap between many views may be due to the contesting parties operating out of incompatible worldviews. Worldviews, even very incoherent ones, do not die quietly. Ideas and theories become precious. They evoke passion. They create gaps between people, and often war. As Thomas Kuhn analyzed this sort of phenomenon, when conflicting evidence reveals that current theories or models are inadequate as explanations for incorporating new evidence, new theories or models must be found which can do so. In the process of working out these new models or theories, their creators may be oblivious to subtle paradigm shifts that eventually lead to revolutions in which worldviews are overthrown and replaced, all because human reason cannot live comfortably with the resulting mental chaos. With you this afternoon, I intend to explore the work of three contemporary thinkers. And I'm going to give two of them very, very short shrift. We seek new models of emergent evolution to sift out whether any of them, or any combination of them, might contribute to a paradigm that transcends these impasses that we've been battling on this problem. First, before we can do that, we have to look at the impasses. Where do we hit brick walls? John Searle is especially clear, blunt, and not gentle in his analysis. Secondly, paradigm shifts involve reintegration. And Karl Wojtyła, more recently known as Pope John Paul II, is especially brilliant in the phenomenological way that he recenters his foundation for ethics. Third and finally, Philip Clayton is especially discerning in unpacking models of complex emergent systems. His voice, I think, is the most rational voice today to explain how you can get more out of less, how the whole can be greater than the sum of the parts. And that's an important feature, not just in this impasse, but in a lot of other problems today. Evolution versus creationism, a whole host of those problems are going to be solved, I think, on that basis. Well, what are some of these impasses? John Searle, as I said, is a passionate and clear thinker. His speech acts in 1969 inspired many of us to explore religious language seriously with the new tools and models of linguistic philosophy. He has been a major contributor in the area of philosophy of mind, my first love. His most recent major books consider the metaphysical problem of free will in terms of consciousness, language, and society. You should have a handout of 3 pages from Searle. In one of those recent books called Freedom and Neurobiology, we're using the book to prop up the projector I'd show you. It has 2 ice cream cones on the front. It's a very thin book. It has 2 lectures that he gave about 6 or 7 years before he published this version of it. And in there he does an interesting thing in an introductory essay. In part 1, nope, I don't have it up here. He very briefly goes over something that only an old philosopher who's thought about this for 30 or 40 years could do. What are the basic facts that we know? And he gives us 8. And if you look at that list, my guess is it's not the same list you would have written yet. And what he also does in that list is he very, very briefly shows in about 30 pages how they all interlace with each other. So take a look at those briefly. Notice the top of his list. One of the basic given facts about which he has no doubt whatsoever is consciousness. It's required to understand intentionality. Intentionality is the philosophical word for how do we hold all that stuff about other objects in our head. That whole process, whether it's in terms of words or other kinds of images, is intentionality. Language can't happen, he would argue, without consciousness and intentionality. Rationality will not happen unless there is language and intentionality. So as you work down through the list, you can see a building crescendo. And at the root of that, one of the most important fundamental things about human nature, he argues, is not language or rationality. That would not, either of them would not have happened without consciousness. And then he makes a couple of surprising things, which I'm sure is going to get him a lot of heat in terms of equating rationality and free will as being coextensive, which medieval philosophers would have disagreed with, that reason and will are 2 different things. And he's arguing they aren't, which is curious. In part 4 of that essay, he does something that I wish I had done. So I just steal it from him and give him praise for it. First, he says, I need to make exactly clear what philosophical movements and tendencies I'm explicitly rejecting. And he goes on to say, I am rejecting, both on one hand, materialism, as it's usually understood, with its attendant reductionism and eliminationism, So if you're a materialist and you say that everything that is always has dimension, always has space and time, it always has matter about it, that's going to automatically lead you into a reductionistic approach to handling science, and you're going to be using an elimination approach as well, and you can't escape that, he points out. On the other hand, the other alternative seems to be dualism. The reality is both physical and non-physical, and never the twain shall meet. Because if they did meet, they'd all be physical. Or you'd be stuck in idealism, where you would just be figments of my imagination, and my imagination doesn't exist in a brain, it just exists in some sort of cosmic mind somewhere. Those are the only possible views metaphysically. So whether you call it dualism or three-world theory or mystification theories, they all come down to the same thing. They are alternatives to a materialistic approach. And then he goes on in fairly short shrift and eliminates both of those options. Materialism, he says, is usually taken to be the denial of the irreducible and ineliminable character of consciousness and intentionality. And notice that hurts, right? Because consciousness was at the top of his list. Materialism eliminates consciousness if you take it straightforwardly and thoroughly. Either they do not exist at all, which is what elimination theory would say, or if they really do, they are really something else. So that consciousness is really a kind of behavior, or it's a brain state, or it's a functional state of the organism itself writ large, or it's something like a computer program. And he had already eliminated that in a little puzzle that he had put together years before called the Chinese man in the box, which was an absolutely brilliant elimination of his opposition on that point. Dualism, he goes on as saying, is usually defined as the view that we live in two distinct realms, the mental and the physical. And he takes these apart one at a time. The three-world view espoused by Popper, Eccles, and Habermas and Penrose, and that's a wide array of scientists and religion leaders, all grouped into that same group, would say that we live in three distinct worlds, the physical, the mental, and the world of culture and cultural products. Well, he goes on, and they're all subject to the same objection, he would argue. The problem with dualism is that it amounts to giving up on the problem. It might turn out that consciousness and intentionality are not part of the real physical world of biology, as he claims. It might, for example, turn out that after our bodies are destroyed, our souls or conscious states will float about in some sort of disembodied fashion. But we now have more than 3 centuries of scientific results that overwhelmingly support the idea that we live in exactly one world, not 2 or 3 or any other number. That's to summarize what he does in a number of pages. But the real problem of dualism is exactly that it ignores the enterprise. It ignores exactly what we're doing. He offers instead, he's not just a nag and a negative thinker, he offers instead a solution. The point for the present purpose is to see that any meaningful predicate immediately allows us to form a corresponding noun phrase. Here comes his linguistic argument, which refers to the property expressed by the original predicate. The existence of the objects named by these noun phrases is automatically guaranteed by the meaningfulness of the predicates. This is also a large part of the solution to the problem of universals, which the Middle Ages never really settled. He also gives you an alternate explanation for numbers, which some people would say are real, that you don't have to go there either. And then finally, on the last of those 3 pages, I give you the very end of a book that he wrote on the mystery of consciousness. The last 3 pages are written out there for your own edification later. That's his proof. That's the elaboration of where he wants to go. But what he's tried to argue, and I think somewhat successfully, is he's identified some of the areas in which the enterprise of trying to solve the problem, the great problem of consciousness, by using either materialism or reductionism, saying it all comes back to matter, that brain is mind, that won't work. And also to say that there's a dualism won't work either. There has to be a third solution. And what we often have done here in philosophy is to use the analogy of trying to jump over the bull in his horns. And the old story was, for the Greeks, you have really two choices. You can break one horn off or break the other horn off, but you never want to try to jump between them. And what I think is being done by these three thinkers is exactly that, to take the bull by both horns and to jump over the entire bull, to get to a solution that has not been adopted before. It's not a matter of taking the sharp points off the horns. We've got to do it anew in a different way. And that's, I believe, where we're going to go. If Searle is correct, and neither of these two dominant views on the positions of mind-body problem or materialism and dualism can provide an adequate account of consciousness, we've got to find a third way. How do we do that? And this is part 2 of today's lecture. We find some pieces that we know probably tie into those other theories that are themselves solid, even though the theories aren't, or the paradigm won't work. We have to create a new paradigm. We have to create a new frame of reference. And that's what many of us are in the process, hopefully, of getting accomplished. I'm going to look, at least briefly, at all three of these fellows. John Searle is a biological naturalist. I've just talked a bit about his critique of the problem. And if we had time today, we would look at all the positives of that. And you have some of that in your hands that we won't have time to lecture about. The second is Philip Clayton's emergent monism. And let me briefly give you some of the background on this. One of the insights comes out of practical knowledge, that we often have situations where a new whole reality is more than the sum of the parts out of which it is made. And a second feature of that phenomenon is you don't change the original parts. They still are what they are. You don't transform them into something else. A couple of simple examples. Water. You all know what water is made of, right? Oxygen, hydrogen. Does water have the properties of oxygen and hydrogen? But that's all it's made up of. It is the sum, it is more than the sum of its two parts, right? Oxygen and hydrogen are both inflammable. In fact, they're both explosive. Water isn't. Isn't that curious? Isn't that odd? How do you get something new made up of things and not have to have the component parts of those things? And some of those components are their properties, their qualities. In this case, their chemical characteristics are not there in the molecule water. Another very common example, you've probably done this. I don't know, if you're from Fort Wayne, you certainly have. There have been a number of occasions where we've had to do sandbagging. You get 10, 20, or hundreds of people and start passing sandbags. If each person carried the sandbag from the truck or the pile all the way to the river, everyone would get worn out and be bushed in a matter of time, and you wouldn't have a levee built. The water would come in. But what do we do as human beings? We take the same components and we organize them in a slightly different way. You get in a line. You stand still. You turn, grab a sandbag, just pass it on to the next person. You don't carry it at all. In fact, when you get good at it, you're not carrying any of the weight of, or much of the weight of the sandbag. You're passing it on. How you organize people adds something novel to a thing so that a sandbag line is not just a collection of people. It's something else. It's a new whole. We do that with teams. We do that with choirs. We do that with all sorts of groupings of people. When you put them together, they become something that did not exist before. They become a new whole. We call that emergent development, emergent growth. And that is very, very well displayed and argued and analyzed inside out by Philip Clayton. We probably won't have time today to spend much time looking at that. But very briefly, what I've given you are some of the key elements of what I see as being contributed by John Searle and Philip Clayton and Karol Wojtyła in those handouts. So the new paradigm from John Searle is, if we look at mind as indeed biological property, that mind is a property of the brain, even though that may sound strange to you, and you're going to have all kinds of kickbacks. Your head is not going to want to accept that notion. And secondly, if we look at emergence, that the mind actually emerges out of something that is not mental, taking that one step farther. And then probably the most shocking thing of all is that the acting person is not a construction, it too is an emergent thing. And that is the position that is taken by Karol Wojtyła, which may come as a shock. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip everything that I've given you there and jump directly to Karol Wojtyła. The key part of his thought that I'm going to be concerned with this afternoon is his notion of acting person. This is a book that he wrote, and I'll give you some of the background on this in a moment. But if you should see that book, immediately grab onto it, find out who the owner is, and give them whatever is in your pocket. I looked on Amazon yesterday, and this book is now selling. The cheapest one I could have found is $355. It has been out of print, and until he is canonized, I hope no one puts it into print, because then my copy value will go up considerably. I did not pay that much for it. We know him by many names. We know him as Pope John Paul. We know him as the Venerable John Paul. On May 1st, we're going to start calling him Blessed John Paul. He's best known as the recent and the second longest ever reigning Roman Catholic Pope. Karol Wojtyła was born in 1920. He was ordained in 1946 after a non-traditional undergraduate seminary preparation in the last years of World War II. Throughout this presentation, I will be referring to him as Karol or as Wojtyła. Those are his given names. I mean no disrespect for this, but I'm not really speaking about him as a bishop or as a pope or any of the work or writing that he did during that period. I'm more focusing on his philosophical insights and the creative novelty of the philosophy and the methodology that he had developed. He was, in my mind, first and continued to be an accomplished philosopher. Do not assume that he is cut from the same cloth as most other Catholic philosophers. Wojtyła himself tells us that he was acquainted with Aristotle and Aquinas, but that he was very strongly influenced by the phenomenological method of Max Scheler. His 1956 doctoral dissertation, an evaluation of the possibility of constructing a Christian ethics on the basis of the system of Max Scheler, shows clear evidence that he creatively uses phenomenological methods to transcend the impasses regarding the human person especially, that were still left over from scholasticism, from Cartesian idealism, and from 19th century positivism. Catholic scholars were stuck for much of the 20th century. I only know of two that broke out of that, and Karol Wojtyła is one of them. He published his seminal work, The Acting Person, in Polish in 1969. In 1979, it was edited and completely revised. The Acting Person then was published as the 10th volume of the Analecta Husserliana, which is a very prestigious publication by a group of followers of the thought of Husserl. It was translated in this edition into English. It is the work of 40 years of one man wrestling with this one central problem and finding a creative way out of it. Aristotelian, Thomistic, and scholastic philosophy are a second language for Carl. He speaks them well, but he doesn't believe in them. He doesn't feel trapped. He can understand and translate them into his thinking. He thinks differently. He revises concepts and conceptual relationships, sometimes more radically than I think he wants people to know. His philosophical synthesis informs his theological and his pastoral accomplishments. If anyone's looking for a doctoral dissertation, I would suggest take that book and show how it leads into his theology of body, because it does not go back to Aquinas. It comes from a different source. A lot of the creative work that he did and his openness to change comes out of his philosophical self-training and the training by others. His thesis at the Angelicum later, The Doctrine of Faith According to St. John of the Cross, focused, take note, what was his topic? It was not a critique of St. John's work, but what is the personal nature of the human encounter with God? That's the one thing he's looking for. Again, this same topic, still being worked out philosophically more than theologically in that book. His ongoing philosophical reconsideration of the human person is also evident in his 1960 Love and Responsibility. For 18 years, he taught ethics. That was his only teaching subject at the Jagiellonian and then at the Catholic University at Lublin. In 1962, as a young bishop of only 4 years, he was stuck near the door of St. Peter's during the Second Vatican Council. From there, he submitted 4 interventions to be discussed at the council. And all of them were composed around the notion of we need to talk about the human person, we need to talk about the current despair over the human condition. Those very man-centered kinds of topics were on the end of his pen. You have a handout, and that handout is with the one with the picture of him on that side, is from the introduction to this book. Notice 2 things that he's saying in that introduction. I'm sure you've read down through that while you were waiting for us to catch up with the technology. But I'll bet you didn't catch what he says there. And this is probably the first difficulty that I have with Carl's work. I can't read it in Polish. This translator did, I think, a good job, but you have to read it 5 times before you get what's going on, because he's not using, first of all, traditional philosophical language, and the translator is translating some poetic syntactic structures, I'm sure, which makes it very, very embedded. Look near the beginning of that essay. The present work cannot be seen otherwise than as a personal effort by the author to disentangle the intricacies of a crucial state of affairs and to clarify the basic elements of the problems involved. If you read that too fast, it becomes a blur of sound. I have indeed tried to face the major issues themselves concerning life, nature, and the existence of the human being directly as they present themselves to man in his struggle to survive while maintaining the dignity of the human being. He's not talking about something very, very abstract. He's talking about something that we all know. We know and experience our struggle in wherever we're struggling in life. We know that. That's not been analyzed. That's not being talked about by philosophy and theology. These struggles of the human being are reflected by the struggles of the author himself, who has attempted in the present work to unravel the subancient apparatus of man's operations, as it may lead either to his victories or to his defeats. So what's he going to be doing? He's looking at human experience, not what people theorize about it, but what we actually experience in the experience of trying to do things. He's not starting with the theory of what mind is. He's not starting with a theory of what will or free will is. Those grand questions are not going to give him the answer. He's tried those. They didn't work. So he starts over with the experience of myself in action. Not myself in the abstract, not myself statically observed, but myself in action. When I catch myself in my conscious behavior, what do I find there? And he's going to find something that we don't find in traditional philosophy. In the next paragraph, our approach runs also counter to another modern trend. Since Descartes, knowledge about man and his world has been identified with the cognitive function. One of the first conclusions that Descartes comes to after this long series of reflections, the only thing he can be sure of first is that I am a thinking being. That's cognition. What are we doing when we're actually performing those mental gymnastics? Is that what we are? Computers also perform mental gymnastics. They also calculate. They also process data. But Descartes didn't know about computers yet. And yet, in reality, does man reveal himself in thinking, or rather in the actual enacting of his existence, in the living out of this process of deliberating, of trying things, of working through our crises? So what he says at the very end there is, what I'm going to do is approach man. If I want to understand what human nature is, I'm going to approach man by analyzing what humans are doing when they're acting, when they're in the process of doing something. After researching and teaching ethics for almost 2 decades, Carl sees that effective ethics requires a sound grasp of what it is to be a human person. And the needed understanding of human person is to be found not in thought and theory, but in the experience of oneself in action. Traditional ethics focuses on actions, their consequences, their motives, all the while assuming that these actions are actions of human agents, without ever investigating what it means to be a human agent. We're missing half the story in our traditional way of doing ethics, he's arguing. Wojtyła's new move is required because the traditional incomplete theories of human nature that we find in Aristotle, Aquinas, Descartes, and others fail to grasp the human person in action. He's not saying they're wrong. They're missing a lot. Take what they are already saying and add to that something that's not been investigated. He focuses not on theories about the human with all their definitions and distinctions. Instead, the necessary insights into the unity of the human being are to be found by studying man in action, not in theory, in practice, not in cognition. Here begins the paradigm shift. That shift changes the whole momentum, the whole angle of attack, and from that we're going to get some new stuff. Reflecting on the experience of a man in the midst of acting, one discovers the richness of what it is to be human. The meaning of the experience of man acts is not to be found by reducing it to sense functions and content, but is discovered by asking what is given directly in the experience. And this is where he steals from Scheller that phenomenological method. And curiously, one of the great ironies is he doesn't end up where Scheller ended up. His theory of value, Scheller's theory of value, Karol Wojtyła sees as being too superficial, that he didn't go far enough. So what do we find given there? Once we look at this business of what is going on, what do we experience when we're conscious of man in action? Man comes into cognitive relationship with himself. In any action, the person is uniquely present as both the subject being aware of what he's doing, at the same time that he may be the object of some sort of inner experience as the doer or the participant in the external action. Both of those going on at the same time. Both of those part of the same experience. Other persons in any actions are experienced only as objects. You never know what they're thinking. You only know externally what they're doing. And then he says, and this is that interesting move that he is shocked to discover, there is an essential unity of distinctive experiences, sets of sensations, sets of emotions, sets of thoughts that are so ordered as objects of experience by the man acting. In order to act, you actually have to put those things together. You actually do it. And just intending to do it doesn't make it happen. You do it. Sensation alone can't provide the stabilization of this unity. It results from the direct cognitive encounters with the objective reality. That could take us an hour to unpack, but it's a powerful claim that he makes, and he supports it. What is directly and irreducibly given when entering into this experience of man acting are not superficial aspects or descriptors of man, like man is a tool maker, but a description of man himself as being a dynamic being, as being in the middle of processes, not standing outside of them and then acting. The standing outside and analyzing doesn't happen. You're already in the action when you feel the pain of trying to solve a problem. Acting is ceaseless. It does not start and stop. It's repeated in the life of every person. It serves as particular moments of apprehending themselves as agents, as apprehending ourselves as the people who are doing something. We never escape that. That is always with us. Both person and action are irreducibly given in the experience of ourselves as agents. And this is where he was trying to get to in the first place. All of those actions are moral because they're human. Not because, and morally right or morally wrong, not because of the consequences, not because of the motives, not because of the circumstances, but because human beings act morally. Now, he wasn't original in this. Kant had said this as well. But he's found it now, not drawn to that conclusion. He's discovered it as simply a given. He also reinterprets the meaning of induction, the meaning of reduction. He has to redefine those because of what he finds in the analysis of man in action. Wojtyła's project of following experience rather than tracing through theories in analyzing the human in action leads him to revising and extending a lot of traditional concepts. Again, I suggested he's a revolutionary not in the sense that he throws out the old and replaces it with the new. He's a revolutionary in the sense that he takes what was given for the value that it has, revises it, re-relates it in new combinations, in new emerging perspectives. And here are a couple of those. Notice, most of the time, the change that he's making is what we call a noetic change. It's the change in the understanding of that word or that term, rather than a change in its metaphysical status. The traditional concept of actus humanus, a human act, as different from an animal act or an act of nature or even an act of God. He changes that notion. When he uses that notion, he's not using it the same way. And this is why I suggest it might be just as well that his book does not come back into print. Because there are a lot of folks in my own faith tradition who would say, oh, he's not a good Catholic philosopher, because he doesn't use the terminology the same way that it's been used for 400 years. It was not in consciousness that his being and acting had their specific origin. The task of this investigation, he says, is to go further and to exhibit consciousness as an intrinsic and constitutive aspect of the dynamic structure, that is, of the acting person. Here I find him agreeing with Searle, surprisingly, because there's very little that he and Searle would agree with. Searle says it starts in consciousness, and Wojtyła is saying something very similar. That if we look at the acting person, the one thing that jumps out most immediately, most quickly, that is the richest unexplored concept, is this concept of consciousness. It's there. That subjective aspect of my being the source of, the subject of, the performer of my actions is something I don't escape unless I fall asleep. But then I'm not acting anymore. Then there are no human actions anymore. But that's where the key comes. Not because I'm using free will. That's not the important part, curiously, here. Even in terms of morality, it turns out not to be. Indeed, man not only acts consciously, but he is also aware of both the fact that he is acting and the fact that it is he who is acting. Hence, he has the awareness of his action as well as of the person in his own dynamic interrelationship. The fact that I'm aware that I am acting and that I am performing this action, those two things are separate notions brought together in that act of consciousness. His awareness is simultaneous with the actual acting itself. So it accompanies it, not causes it. It is also present before and after that action. We are very aware that I'm going to do something, or I did something, and it was me that did it. That consciousness exists before and after, as well as during the performance of the action. Every action finds consciousness, if one may say so, already there, quoting him again. Consciousness accompanies, and here's an insight I have found nowhere else. One of the functions of consciousness is that it mirrors the whole activity, and the person in the performing of that activity makes that present in a way that objective observation does not. From the inside, it's like the light goes on and I can see myself, or the shadow of myself, being the performer, the discoverer, the troubled person, whatever it is that I'm doing in my behavior, in my action. That consciousness reflects that. It illuminates it. It creates a life. It's not a cause of it. It's not a property of it. It's not a result of it. But it makes it present to ourselves in a way that it is not present to anybody else. Again, it is its presence that makes him act as a person, not just a performer, and experiences acting as an action of a person. That's an important insight for him. A second very important shift in the paradigm that we see in Karl Wojtyła. Consciousness is no longer thought of as a thing. It's not a faculty or a power of thinking or of knowing or of mental behaviors. It's a state. It's an aspect of the subjectiveness of the action of the performing person. That's an important metaphysical shift. It's not a component part of who we are. It's a state or a condition of presence. That we are present to ourselves, we are present as the recognized actor of our own actions. It is necessary, nevertheless, to note that the sum or the resultant of the acts of consciousness determine the actual state of consciousness. Now, when we unpack this, and I will be doing that not today, some other time, that's where we see that consciousness is the trigger, the source, the fountain out of which that emergence occurs that we talk about as reasoning, as logic, as language, and as free will. It emerges out of that. Animals don't have free will because they don't have consciousness. It's not because they can't think. It's not because they have something else called an instinct. They just don't have this thing that causes the emergence of a new kind of quality that we call free will. Consciousness itself does not exist as the substantive subject of the acts of consciousness. It exists neither as an independent factor nor as a faculty. Nevertheless, from what has already been said of the nature of consciousness, it is clear, he says, that it is entirely dissolved in its own actions and in their specific character of being aware. It saturates everything. That's why you don't even notice it. And it provides two functions. We already talked about one. It mirrors and illuminates the activity. When the acting person is thinking, analyzing, and so on, it does that by objectifying the objects of his awareness in his own cognition. So we can do that reflexive stuff, right? I can go, I'm thinking about something. Oh, I'm thinking about my thinking about that. I'm thinking about my being worried, or I'm worried about my thinking. I can objectify, I can take those things that are part of my consciousness and make them now the new subject matter of my further examination, right? I can only do that because of consciousness. When I'm acting and reacting, I can't do that. Your heart can't do that. It just beats. It can't stop to consider whether it ought to. It can't put itself at a distance so that it can examine itself. Are you with me? Does that make sense? It's kind of tricky. There's a sense in which a doctor, if he's going to perform surgery on you, has to move you in a different place in his consciousness. You have to become an appendectomy case rather than John Q. Public. If he thinks of you as a person, he can't cut you open. If he thinks of you as a disease or a diseased part, then he can cut that off. By objectifying it, you can handle it differently. You can perform operations on it differently. Secondly, it interiorizes what it mirrors. And this was a surprise to him to have to come to this solution. I can reflect on it because I have this self-awareness, and the awareness of myself as a self that is acting, but that becomes me then. That changes, and he's going to say later, it helps me to emerge. This is what traditionally we've called self-transcendence, that we actually have the ability of becoming more than we were to begin with. And that begins with the experience that we have that our actions are recognizable as actions of our own, not of someone or something else. A third major shift, and as you notice, that's the last piece of paper. The body-soul relationship is analyzed and reconfigured as components of the man-action experience and the resulting analysis that comes from that. And what he does here is a kind of interesting thing for a phenomenologist. Remember, he has been a believer. He has been part of a church tradition that has Aristotle and Thomas and all of the others. A tradition that is heavily dualistic, very much affected by Plato, that body and soul are two separate things, somehow temporarily glued together, and one of them breaks loose in what we call death. But he goes, that's not what we experience in consciousness. And one of the things we do experience in consciousness is we never experienced it stopping. So it's not that the soul slips away, something else must be going on in what we call dying. And another whole set of reflections that he makes is that what is happening all of the time is you're continually compounding at new or higher levels more and greater wholes. Person is made up of the integration of soul and body. It's not a soul with a body attached that makes it a person. Person is person because you are physical and you are also not physical at the same time. How does it integrate that? And that's what he spends a fair amount of time on. And I have a problem because some of that is not yet in English. And I've got to go find it. because he keeps referring to things that he's done in other places. So the body is understood as being both semantic and psychic. The soma, the physical part, the body part, and still at the same time there is a life function going on. The Greek word psyche does not mean soul in the sense of spirit. It means soul in the sense of this thing that makes the whole body an organism instead of a whole collection of parts. The soma part is the parts. That's the anatomy. The physiology comes from the psyche. And he says, what's amazing is the psyche integrates the soma. When you're alive and functioning, it's the systems that keep you adjusting, continually adjusting to what's going on around you. If you've ever had physiology, you learned that. No? The soul is not directly able to be experienced. In your consciousness, there is no consciousness of soul as a separate thing. There is only a consciousness of me doing things that are spiritual, as well as things that are physical. But we can intuit it. That's not metaphysical proof yet. He says it can be understood, though, it can be discovered to be the basic principle for transcendence and integration at those higher levels of mental activity like reasoning and free will, memory, any of those kinds of functions that cannot be explained simply by physical constructions, physical behaviors. I found the working through, which he was somewhat frustrating sometimes, because most of what he has written, most of what he wrote in his philosophical years and continued to write after he became a pope, that in philosophical form, has still not been published in English. It's in Polish. It's circulating in Poland, but I can't get a hold of any of that yet. And one day we shall be able to get a hold of it. I'm also inspired by his openness, his willingness to challenge categories that don't work, to see if he can find a better way to get those to produce answers to the questions that they don't solve now. And apparently that was still his temperament, even in his later years. There's a story I ran into, a personal reflection from someone, that he had a meeting with John Paul as Pope in his office, and John Paul kept looking at his watch. And when they finally finished his business, John Paul looked at his watch and he smiled and he says, "Oh, we have some time now." He said, "You're a philosopher. You've done philosophy. I am too. Let's talk philosophy for the next 40 minutes. So they did. That there was a part of him and a part of this kind of work, of this kind of curiosity, that never died, despite what he found himself doing in his own ministries. I think what we have here are some healthy pieces that might make contributions toward solving that tough, hard problem in consciousness. How do we link up the fact that we have experiences and all that we can digest and analyze out of this experience of our own subjective awareness of ourselves as the performers of our own actions? And how can we link that up with what psychologists and physiologists are able to describe with electrodes and all kinds of other information about the brain and how it operates? How can we get and transcend to a model that can actually pull all of that together, rather than just assume that it's either matter or it's mind and body, rather than some sort of integration of the two? I agree with him and with Earl and with Clayton that there is an integration that is going on there, that seems to be an intuition. The hard problem is, how are we going to get a theory together? How are we going to get a metaphor together that will carry that burden? Thank you.
It occurred to me as you were talking that John Paul II and Charles Curran, situation ethics, would have a tremendous discussion and a great interest in each other at the beginning. I think it would go different directions or it would different conclusions. But I sense that the two of them would have a delight in just philosophizing.
I very much agree. Charles Curran gets into trouble because he is a creative thinker. He tries to come at things from a different angle, and he takes a situation ethic point of view. Karl Wojtyla would not, as a philosopher or as a pope. That there are answers to those questions that can be discovered. There is a natural law theory, but a different one hidden away in what he analyzes in terms of what it is that we are, how it is that we are human, that we can discover in the experience of our own acting as a human being. There's a natural law theory buried in that, but it's not the traditional one. So they would both agree. They both have some of the same complaints, I think, but they would not end up solving problems the same way.
There's delight in the human action, in the human activity.
That they would enjoy. Yeah, I agree.
I'm just curious, if I remember right, John Paul was an actor, I believe, in his early days. And as I was, even the title, The Acting Human, I thought, in order to hone consciousness, I'm thinking of all the acting drills and study that an actor does to become aware of, you know, how would you feel if you were Hamlet? How would you feel if you were Jacinta or some character in a play or a movie? And then I think, well, his philosophy is very interesting and I like it, but I'm wondering how much of today's ordinary person does more objectifying of other people, of self, of routines and so on. And I mean, do you have any perspective on that? Because I think it has a lot to say about then personal responsibility and free will.
On the first point, I had noticed the same thing, not just the pun of being involved in acting as an actor. I have not yet found any samples of using acting or acting situations or his own playwright experience. I just don't see, and he should have. He should have drawn on those examples if he wasn't using them in his own motivation. I would think that they'd be obvious examples he uses. And he doesn't. He, unlike Lonergan and others, he doesn't take concrete examples into play, which is why he has to say something 5 or 6 times over and close all the loops so that you don't misunderstand him. But he doesn't give you concrete situations, which often lead, I think he's afraid of, into bad metaphors, that you take the example and objectify it too much. I don't see him analyzing the dynamic of objectifying. He doesn't seem to be much interested in the mechanics of that. What he is fascinated with is that our own objectifying behavior becomes part of our consciousness. That it's our consciousness that integrates in our awareness, it integrates ourselves and someone else, that we are doing the Romeo and Juliet story in our bubble, if you will, of consciousness, and then go in action and kind of check it out. He does not, and many times, he'll at some juncture, as he's getting close to that, he'll say, this is for psychology. He's decided that he's not a psychologist, that's not something where he can be accountable. So he just doesn't go there. He says this can be explained. He's pretty confident that will be explained and that more understanding will happen. The one thing in terms of reductionism and induction that I think was important that I skipped over rather quickly was in his methodology, you never leave anything out. Once it's part of your experience, you have to keep it there. That if you zero in, if that's what you mean by objectifying, he doesn't want you to do that. So when I'm aware of myself as an acting person, struggling with a dilemma, I have to keep in mind, I have to keep in the forefront, on the radar, that I'm angry, that I'm upset, that I'm frightened. I have to keep all of those other little pieces of what I'm conscious of there. If I ignore them and concentrate and create white noise or something, he does not want us to go there. That's always, in the past, in his mind, led to mistakes. So objectifying has as its function for him to add more richness to my action. So that, as I remember throwing a baseball when I was a kid, and then all the baseball games and all the funny maneuvers that I've heard about and watched other people do now become part of my richer idea of what baseball is. That I can't just go back and say, well, throwing a baseball is what I did in 4th grade. It's an accumulating kind of thing that keeps getting integrated by consciousness. But he doesn't display an objectification of memory or other minds or any of those kinds of topics that you would hope he would. But he just doesn't go there.
I had a question about where you sort of ended up in the discussion of soul.
I left you hanging?
Well, no, just a question. In terms of where it's classified or where it's discussed that soul is beyond direct experience, it can be intuited. Then what does that mean? What does that mean for the soul? How does it, if it's not a dualistic?
It's not an it. Yeah, he's very much heading in that direction. I can't experience it directly, the way I can experience my being a person. I know the soul is somehow involved in that. He is troubled by and suspicious of trying to make it into an object. Because I think he's, and this is why I want to see more of what he'd written, because in some of that section he talks about some other essays that he had written in the Husserl Society that had already been shared, and I want to get a hold of those. But I have the very strong suspicion is in his treatment of hylomorphism, which is the technical term for the traditional scholastic notion of body and soul, that he's going to approach it from the point of activity, not from the point of metaphysics. So I think for him, and a series of hints is that it's the person that is the real thing, that I'm not a combo of two things. But what is soul then in that? Is it as body is it something as an object of my observation and experience that can be integrated in my experience of myself as acting, that I'm acting with my body. I'm talking with gestures, sound making, and so on. I'm very conscious of that. And that's changeable. That's not the same Earl Kumfer that you saw last week or a month ago or 20 years ago. But that soul seems to be something of a continuity within that self-consciousness. Now, is that a field of experience, or is it a distinct, separate, discrete object? I think he's heading in the direction that it's not a direct, discrete object. That what is the new whole in me is person. And I am spiritual as well as physical. That soul is at least an aspect of who I am rather than a component part. I think that's where he's heading. And I see that in his theology of body. That it's the interplay of those two aspects of us rather than the interface of two gears working together, two parts working together. I think that's where he's going. And he may be somewhat discreet because, that would set off all kinds of alarms of people who would not bother to read the background and how he got to that notion. But now that he's dead, we can pull that out and find it.
Dr. Kumfer, you mentioned that Wojtyla wanted to stay away from the psychological aspect of things, but it certainly seems like he could have made a living as a psychologist these days if his gig at the Vatican didn't work out. And I just wondered what your thoughts were. I know he might have wanted to stay away from it, but certainly behavioral psychologists and analytical psychiatrists these days, stretching back from Carl Jung and the Swiss psychiatrists and such, utilize a lot of what the action of the human. So I just wondered what your thoughts were and how much background what Tiva may have had, and
My understanding is that there were a number of folks in the Husserl group, especially those that were following Scheller and his value theory, that were psychologists. So I think he had psychologists around him, and he just kept deferring, ask them. I'm going to throw it at you from a philosophical point of view. And I would assume that in some of those discussions he had good responses from them. I think he respected the fact that he was not a trained psychologist, and he didn't have the advanced knowledge and skills that they had, and that's why he avoids it. My own personal view is, I remember the old Dewey Decimal System, and the fact that philosophy was the larger category in the 100s, and psychology was a smaller subdivision within that. And even as late as a century ago, my position would not be a chair of or a full professor of philosophy. It would be professor of philosophy and psychology, that the two were often so embedded. William James, for instance, does philosophy and does psychology. They had not become discrete, separate methodologies yet. But by the later half of the 20th century, they were two separate disciplines. And I think he's reflecting that. There's so much going on, especially in empirical psychology, that I just have not kept up on, that I suspect might be useful on this project. In our local group of the fellows that we have no psychologist in the group. I wish we did, because they could save us a lot of grief. But consciousness is not a topic, I don't think, that's restricted to philosophy. I think it shows up in just about every other field. So I think what he makes as a contribution here might be useful to them as well. Thank you very much for coming. There's some things to nibble on outside, some food. This is not a fast day, so enjoy.